Cool. Well, let's get started. Hi, everybody. Thank you for showing up for our conversation this afternoon. This is a first of a few conversations that we hope to have from the framework of being radically honest about what we're faced with, what we hope for, and to really unpack some of the strategies that people are using around the country to deal with issues of deep inequality and inequity. So thank you again for coming. I'd like to thank our panelists. And my name is Charlene Sinclair. I'm with Demos. I am the Senior Advisor to the Movement Strategies Department at Demos. And we're here with a whole bunch of wonderful people that have joined in addition to the panelists that I'll introduce in a second. If you can and choose to, please, give a shout out by putting your name and where you're from in the chat so that we know who's joining us. A bit of housekeeping. We are recording this session so that we can share it with folks afterwards. So if you do not want to join a recorded session, please just put yourself on, well, everybody's on mute, but just so you know that we are recording, we're asking that as things come up for you, please share it either in the chat or in the Q&A. When the panelists have concluded, Trisha will actually begin to start reading the questions and fielding it to the panelists as we move forward. Big shout out to Trisha at Demos, as well as Ava, who is in the back running all the tech, and so making sure that we're all set. So we've got a lot to talk about, and let's get started. As I mentioned, my name is Charlene Sinclair. And in this moment, we are faced with so much, in addition to the mountain of inequity that we've had just from the beginning of time in Black communities. We are now hit with this moment where we're in a pandemic and we're seeing communities just completely collapse. In addition to that, the amount of unrest that is happening as people are uprising in the streets, rising up around the violence and the terror that is happening in Black communities, rising up around that inequity, rising up because they're calling for something different, actually provides a moment of opportunity, even as we see that this pandemic has created a squeezing of resources to the point where many states, many communities have the ability to be able to say that there is not enough. And we know that that kind of language is continuously being leveled against our communities, that there is not enough. But as we have also seen in this moment of pandemic, that when there is a value that the people in power have, the purse strings will open. And the value that people had when we first started this pandemic was that they would save the airlines, they would save big businesses, they would save, the things that they thought was necessary to continue to move the consumerist economy that we're in. But they would struggle against the idea of giving people the resources to be able to stay home and stay safe. So we're having this conversation because we have some of the, leading organizers, policy advocates, and activists around the country that are really grappling with these questions from a local perspective, from the state perspective, and a federal perspective. And I don't want to take up too much time in the conversation with me. I want to be able to just turn this over to have them be able to tell us some of the things that they are wrestling with in this current moment, as well as some of the strategies that they're beginning to start to unpack and peel back and move forward. This is a conversation. It is a dialogue. While folks are absolutely experts in their field, they are also from the stance of a deep engagement with communities. So we really encourage you to engage with us, because it is only when all of our voices and our heads are combined around these gripping problems can we find solutions to move us forward. And so let me start first by asking, as I open up for folks to first say your name very clearly in case I mangle it, and the organization that you're from. Give us a little brief on the organization, and then move into the question that I'm posing as the beginning for how you start the conversation with us. The first person we are going to start with is Miss Afia Atamensa. Did I get that right? So Miss Afia.
You did this, thank you.
All right. I'm so excited. We're going to go local, state, and then national. And I'm really excited to begin with Afia because Afia comes out of Community Voices Heard in New York City. She's the executive director there. And Community Voices Heard is also deep to my heart. It's one of the first organizations I've ever worked with and was begun by welfare moms. As a welfare mom myself, doing welfare mom organizing, this question around investment, the ways in which women, Black women, brown women, and the social production that they actually have within society is often negated. And they're framed as more parasites than implementors. Then it is really exciting to see the way this work has evolved over time. And Afia is going to talk to us about their work, and in particular, focusing on, I believe, a lot of the work that you all are doing around the importance of housing, housing stability, housing affordability, and housing, and all of that as a mechanism for stabilizing equality. So Afia,
thank you so much. Thank you. So let me start by just thanking the Demos family, Sabille, Rodney, Carol, Arlene, all the amazing folks for having this today and for thinking of me, so thank you. As Charlene says, my name is Afia Atamensa. I say that I'm blessed to be able to serve as the executive director of Community Voices Heard. And, you know, just a little on CVH, we're celebrating our 26th year. And as Charlene said, we started as an organization comprised mostly of Black and Latinx women who were women on public assistance, who were tired of the narrative of the welfare queen, right? And had this radical idea, even back in the bad old days of the Giuliani administration in New York City, that they were people of God and had a right to dignity, and sought to have an organization that didn't purport to serve them, but was beholden to the membership. And I just think it's something that I always want to steep in when I think about the foresight of our founding mothers. But a lot of folks at that time opted for organizations that were service, right? They saw a service organization, nothing wrong with service organization. But our founding mothers at Community Voices Heard opted for power, right? So that we could have self-determination and understanding by folks who were always the most impacted about how they're going to chart their lives, their communities, what will best help to steer their communities and themselves and their families in power with and being able to have self-determination over themselves and their communities. So over the 26 years, we have deepened our analysis and move not just for always a strong social safety net, which is our holding, that's where we'll always be, but issues of affordable housing, criminal justice reform, immigrant justice, equality for climate equity, and transportation. So all small issues that solved easily. And in New York City, we're in Westchester County, Orange, and Dutchess County. So New York City and the suburbs up to 2 hours north. And this conversation about, first of all, I love the framing of a radical honesty, right? In candor and with love, so that we can move forward our body politic and get stronger in this fight. And, you know, what I'm particularly struck by is the idea that there's, in a long time, a real reckoning of the narrative on white supremacy, its fallacy, and how it has affected clearly communities of color, Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities, but also the America as a whole. And this disinvestment, right, is a byproduct of that myth, that fallacy of white supremacy and racial capitalism, all things that flow from it. Because to continue white supremacy, then of course you have to devalue everyone else that's not in that form, right? So you divest from communities of color and Black communities, you take away from Indigenous communities, but also there's a devaluing of all public systems, which of course affects our communities, and by our, I'll say as a Black woman, Black communities and immigrant communities and Latinx communities. But as we can see in the midst of this COVID crisis, it is impacting us all. I'm a mom. Before folks came on, I had to do the whole bribery and threatening of my kids. Is if you come through this door when I'm on this panel, right? And a lot of us are doing that and grappling with whether or not schools are going to open, right? A clear system of divestment of the public education system, particularly as Black and brown folks who are part of the public education system. We saw white flight out of that system and the subsequent divestment. So I am particularly grateful for the amazing work of organizers across this country who have really framed a hard stop on the current narrative and forced an unapologetic, radical reckoning of that and what it means and what it does to us. So in New York City, where we were for a long time the epicenter of this COVID crisis, right? We saw it in so many ways where communities of color, particularly Black and brown communities, are the folks who were the, essential workers, now essential, a lot of whom are the membership of Community Voices Heard, right? The grocer, the nurse's aide, the hospital orderly, right? All those folks who have been doing the hard work and have to keep doing it and are unable to work remotely, who were, of course, the folks who were most getting sick and how that affected those communities. So this I see as an amazing time, always in the middle of crisis, is not an opportunity, because I don't want to sound callous, but a leverage point. And I am deeply grateful to be in movement at this time, to be a part of pushing that leverage point, so that we can't have this status quo anymore. So that's part of how we're working to reframe the idea of divestment, understanding its roots as part of a racist system, how it disproportionately affects Black and brown communities. And that's purposeful, right? It's not a byproduct, that's the exact intent. But then also having the larger conversation that as you continue to divest from our communities, it also has a collateral effect on white communities as well.
Thank you so much. We'll circle back. I want to get the voices of the other panelists in by turning to Mark. Mark, Afia mentioned a little bit about this when she talked about education and what we're up against in this COVID moment. And one of the planes of engagement that we don't even think about fully when we talk about investment in and liberation of Black and Latinx people is this field of education. Now, Du Bois said this is one of the greatest stealth revolutionary tools in the country is education. And so, and as we see at any given point in the lives of Black and Latinx people, there is a fight to actually keep that investment away from our communities, whether it was with Black people ensuring that we would not be educated as if while we were enslaved. Coming out of that, we fought through and created a huge public education system. There's been a constant fight around the separate but equal and what is an equal system. And all the way now to higher education, where we're seeing even in the moment as we sit here, that Latinx folks, foreign-born folks, Black folks that can't actually afford to have this piece of education as part of their pathway towards equity and deep equality is at risk yet again. So can you talk to us about, this piece around the divestment in our educational structure, and what are the challenges that are facing our communities because of that?
Yeah, thank you, Charlene, and thanks, Afia. I don't know that I can more brilliantly. I know that I can't more brilliantly link, the origins of white supremacy and extraction from Black, brown, and Indigenous folks of this country with divestment in public goods and public systems, both on a narrative level, on a story we tell ourselves level, and also on a policy level, and how that's been the intent, right, all along. Charlene, again, you brought it up brilliantly because, time and again, we have intentionally locked people out of Black people out of public goods broadly. Sometimes we say that because there aren't enough resources, but as you said, Charlene, when we talk about valuing something, somehow magically we open the purse strings. And I think, an area that I have focused many years now on is higher education, and how sort of original structural racism shows up time and time again in our divestment in higher education. There's every level of education you can see this, but higher education specifically is, I think, a really interesting case study. And you know, the way that it has worked for several decades now, not just a few years, is that as folks demand for themselves more education, as we ask people to get more education, either to follow their dreams or gain a foothold, keep a foothold in the middle class, we have at the same time failed to meet that investment time and time again. So that can mean making just education affordable for people, or stopping runaway costs for families. That can mean investing in students of color, Black students, Black faculty, crucial supports that students need to see themselves through school. That can mean investing to the point where certain institutions and schools reflect state or local racial makeup and diversity, and actually look like the communities that they're purported to serve. It can mean any number of things that we have failed time and time again. And we know that, you know, just to speak on the state level a little bit, states have a lot of competing budget priorities. We know this. Higher education in particular tends to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, discretionary part of a state's budget. And the trend that we've seen consistently is that on a per student basis, states have, you know, put a hot knife through higher education budgets, or just not increase them, as we've seen more demands, as the face of the American student has changed from someone, you know, who primarily looks like me to someone who, you know, who we've traditionally locked out of the system. So, you know, this is particularly a dynamic that I think is worth grappling with and wrestling with in this moment, because in recessions and tough job markets, at times of economic crisis, we see more demand for education. We see more people go back to school, and we have seen time and again states cut and not increase those investments. So, you know, just to speak on the results of this, right? This is not just like a theoretical thing. This is a major reason why we have a Black student debt crisis in this country. This is a major reason why we see community college, who enroll more students than any other type of colleges, whose enrollment is more than half non-white. The reason we see HBCUs, public HBCUs in particular, be constantly told to do more with less. You know, that is a manifestation of our priorities, both in tough times and in quote unquote not tough times. You know, so I think, you know, we can get into this more in terms of, you know, how other parts of our economy or safety net or lack thereof show up in the education or the higher education system specifically, and how we are continually putting burden upon burden upon burden on Black communities. But I don't think I could put it better than talk about, you know, this is a matter of priorities. You know, as recently as a few years ago, there were nearly 20 states where taxpayers were spending more on jails and prisons than they were on colleges and universities. There are states, in good times and bad, that are willing to forego decades of tax revenue just to get an Amazon, a Foxconn, any number of multinational corporations to set up their headquarters, and then allow them not to pay taxes, not contribute, not be good corporate or public citizens, and actually allow them off the hook when promised jobs don't materialize. So, you know, these and other sort of revenue decisions, public budget decisions, they're all there, and they all reflect priorities. And we know that states aren't going to be able to do this alone. This is why I'm really interested, you know, to hear Angela's discussion of what the federal role in investing in Black communities in particular is. But there are choices that state lawmakers are making every day and every year and every budget cycle, and that we need to scrutinize and hold folks accountable for. And states that are making conscious, unconscious, or, you know, intentional decisions to extract resources that could otherwise go to correcting some of the ills that we've seen.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. And what a great segue into Angela. Angela, hi, it's good to have you. And I think that Mark talked about, you know, the centering of values. And we are now, with what has happened with COVID-19 and the ways in which state budgets were just not prepared to respond, that the shrinking of those state budgets actually put us on this precipice of either catastrophe or possibility based on where that value ends up. And so we'd really like to hear you talk about just, you know, this trajectory that often has us believing that we don't have enough. You know, it kind of like leans into our worldview around the importance of thrift And the idea that you should sacrifice, and the notion that somehow the federal government or our states are functioning like our personal checkbook, right? And so, which makes us more amenable to being able to actually condone the level to which the spending is not in our interest, yet the shrinking and the squeezing is done against our best interest. So can you talk to us a little bit about, that framework of austerity and how we can push back against getting caught in it?
Yeah, thanks, Charlene, and glad to be here with Afia and Mark as well. My name is Angela Hanks. I'm Deputy Executive Director at the Groundwork Collaborative. We are an organization that is dedicated to developing, in partnership with many of the folks on this call and others, and advancing a coherent, persuasive, progressive economic worldview and narrative. And much of that is sort of predicated on this idea that we don't really have a good story for how the economy works. And the problem is the other side does have a story for it. And like fundamentally it's racist, it's rooted in anti-Blackness. And we have to have some way to respond to that that's rooted in our values and our understanding of what's good for us. There's a lot to unpack there. I think going to the first thing you mentioned, Charlene, this idea of the politics of austerity. There's sort of austerity as an economic principle, which we can talk about why that's faulty, and I'll get to that in a moment. But there's also sort of the idea of austerity that's inherently political, and again, is both rooted in white supremacy and is used as a tool to perpetuate it. In this specific context of the recession, where we're seeing states slashing budgets, certainly you see the kinds of decisions that that leads to in terms of where that disinvestment comes from and what it means, and where, frankly, the funds are recouped, right? It's both that we see disinvestments in things like higher education, which is worse for Black students, but then we also see the revenue recouped from things like fines and fees, which also fall disproportionately on Black folks. So there's sort of the recession context of what it means when austerity is enacted, but it's also like, I think you have to think about why there is a move to austerity. So much of austerity politics is rooted in notions of deservedness, rooted in notions of sort of individualism. I think what you mentioned about the need to tighten your belt and to go on your own, as if we don't have an economy where we do fund plenty of things, in a society where we do make choices every day about what we want to invest in and what we don't. At this particular moment, there's no reason why we can't make sure that people are safe and healthy and have food on their table and roofs over their heads. Those are policy choices. It's not a matter of scarcity of where we can afford it. And in fact, most economists right now are saying that actually what we need to do is invest significantly in states and localities in making sure that workers can continue to get an income through our UI system, that eviction moratoria stay in place so people aren't forced to pay rent when they don't have a job. That's actually like not only better for people, in our view, what we say all the time is we are the economy. It's better for the economy writ large when we're all doing well. The idea of austerity is sort of rooted in this idea, excuse me.
No, we're all at home. Okay. Let your baby bark, because you're going to see my grandsons coming in here half naked looking for stuff anyway. Go ahead.
Sorry, someone's coming to get the dogs. They're fine. But there's this idea that allows austerity to take hold, and then there's the consequences that austerity has, the real consequences on Black communities, on brown communities, on indigenous communities, because we move from this false sense of scarcity to actually making resources that should not be scarce. I think while
Angela, stop for a minute, breathe, just breathe. We're all here at home trying to figure out how to do this good thing. So, and what you have to say is deeply important. So let's do it. Go ahead.
Okay. That was mostly it. I think, the thing I just want to underscore is, as we're having conversations about what it means to invest and what it means to work from this austerity frame, we really have to challenge the notions that, you know, individuals on their own are going to solve massive societal problems. You know, right now we're experiencing a huge economic crisis. At the same time, we're experiencing a pandemic. That is not something that individuals on their own can solve. And frankly, the idea that we could is sort of silly. It's economically incoherent, and it's also deeply damaging for so many communities, especially the communities that are most vulnerable.
Thank you. You are so right. I want to bring Afia back into the conversation too, because, you know, you are sitting in a space that has always been, you know, you're always working with vulnerable populations. We have seen the exacerbation of that vulnerability, and particularly around this piece on housing, like the uncertainty of that. I know that when I was younger, I could kind of imagine being able to get through anything, and the deepest fear was somehow not being able to hold my family together in a space. And so, and we're seeing how so much of our resources get eaten up in the attempt to be able to provide that level of stability. And I know that you all have done a ton of work around that, a ton of work around, like, what is, you take this one piece that is seen as a personal commodity, which is the, you know, housing and housing security, and how do you actually transform that into a conversation around what does affordability look like? What's the importance of that affordability for stability and even for moving us forward? What do you think?
No, thank you for that. And I mean, this all goes into a bit of what Mark and Angela and what you started this on, frankly, priorities. I know this was framed as budgets are a moral document, but they're also seriously a document about power, right? Like, who has power, who's seen as valuable. And I think that really shows up in the housing space, right? For New York City, about 60% of our membership live in public housing. The disinvestment in public housing has been over decades, right? We recently released a report about the impacts of living in the New York City Housing Authority, the health impacts when disinvestment happens and you have mold and things of that nature. But even out for a long time, it was seen as something punitive. You live in New York City, so you're paying higher rent. But we see that the issue of housing as a commodity affects us all. Our membership in the suburbs of New York City, a lot of them pushed out, right? They were living in Brooklyn before it was cool, living in the Bronx before they tried to rename it Piano District, and are continually moved out into the suburbs, which are also found and becoming more and more unaffordable. The lack of rental housing, the lack of opportunity for home ownership, with a lot of particularly Black families still reeling from the Great Recession, right? And being not just vulnerable, I like to say targeted, right? It's not that we have like weaker genes. We are purposely targeted for subprime mortgages. We are targeted by putting in certain areas. And so when we're seeing here now with, again, with the COVID pandemic, how can you have safety, right? How can you shelter in place if you don't have a place to stay? And if your housing is substandard, or you're doubled and tripled up, right? As people's, you know, pre-COVID, our membership base, hell, my staff and me, the conversation is everything's going up aside from my check, right? I can't barter with Con Ed. I'm gonna owe Sally Mae money till I'm in the ground, right? Like, all these things are happening here, but the checks weren't getting bigger. And still the budget priority was a focus on power. You know, in New York City, I have to shout out my comrades at, we're part of Communities for Police Reform and Brooklyn Movement Center and Vocal, because we said, if we're really going to talk about centering Black lives, don't perform for me. Let's see it in the budget. So let's do a little something called divest $1 billion from the New York Police Department that gets paid to kill myself and my family, right? Let's move that billion in the middle of the greatest pandemic that most of us will see in our lifetime, where we have 78,000 homeless families in New York City, where we have almost 13% unemployment in New York City, where folks cannot feed themselves, where people are scared to death that they're going to be evicted after the eviction moratorium. Let's take $1 billion and move that to services. Right? Let's not perform this anymore. Don't paint nothing for me on Fifth Avenue, homie. Show it in your budget. And unfortunately, we didn't have folks who were poised to do that. But even though it didn't get fully over the victory line, when I talk about my deep love for my comrades who've moved this narrative so that we're even having these conversations about no more performance, right? Show me with your chest, right? Like, show me in your budget, show me in your actual work. So when I think about what $1 billion can do for Black and brown communities across the New York City metro area who are scared that they're going to be evicted, who are trying to refine jobs in a time where so many small businesses that are the lifeline for communities of color are closing because PPP missed us, right? So all these things about, when I say that my 4 mothers at CVH were about.
Uh-oh, I think we lost. Okay, it's not just me. Y'all all look just as confused as I do. All right, so just as Afia was running it down, I was like on the edge of my seat. But let's keep the conversation going because I know she's going to be coming back in, and I want to really focus in on this piece around the commodification of our basic human needs. You know, Mark, you were talking about that. You alluded to that when you talked about education. Let's like really dig into that piece around how our basic needs, the basic things that we need to move our lives forward, our families forward, are being so deeply commodified. And Angela, just to get you sort of set up and primed, you're thinking about, you know, what are we not thinking about in this moment? You know, what might possibilities be that we're not quite thinking about that has been churning in your head that you might have thought was kind of crazy, but in this space, you know, like act like you're, you know, sitting around the table with a glass of wine with your homies and you're just gonna throw something out there as a way to open up the space for us to start having a conversation amongst everyone. Okay, so Mark, that commodification piece.
Yeah, Charlene, I wanna push back on the assumption that we're not sitting here with a glass of wine, right, just off screen, right?
Look, don't tell people that I'm
times.
having a drink too. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and also, you know, when Afia can jump back in, I was also on the edge of my seat, so happy to make sure she, you know, she can finish her points and reclaim the mic a little bit. But yeah, just your question. I mean, like, it's no secret that we have what we think of as public goods, and we start thinking of public goods and turn them into individual goods, or commodify them or individualize them, or whatever word you want to use, when, you know, when the face of the people who as a from a policy perspective or from a narrative perspective that are using those goods changes. So like, again, I go back to higher education, that the disinvestment in higher education happened as the face of the American student changed, as the typical person going to college was not white but Black or brown, was not male but female, was not 18 and out of high school but was actually a bit older. That's not an accident, right? And that's not something that is siloed only to this one policy area. We had enough public resources to make college free when the face of the American student looked different. So, you know, I think this is obviously about power. This is who is seen as valuable in this economy, as Afia mentioned, and as we've been talking about. And it's just about priorities, right? I keep coming back to that, and I think that's obviously a theme of what we're talking about here. You know, one other piece here that I think is important to bring in is that we need to talk about the interconnectedness of these systems, right? So when we fail to invest in making housing affordable or secure, when we fail to invest in childcare, when we fail to invest in public infrastructure, you know, public transportation, we fail to raise wages, the minimum wage specifically. These all obviously compound upon themselves. You know, it was Afia's point, like everything is going up on my check. But it you know, on a student trying to get their way through college, if we're not making housing affordable and secure, they're going into debt to pay rent, not just tuition. They're going into debt to pay for kids. 1 out of every 4 college students has a kid of their own, right? Like, these things all intertwine with each other in some really fundamental ways, which is why I think the conversation about who has power and who has voice and agency in economic decision making is so crucial, right? So yeah, that's sort of my broad thought on it.
Cool beans. Afia, we
Oof.
It's gotta be an Alfie.
look. We,
I was about time and pull the cord out the computer. It is that day. Sorry, y'all.
no problem at all. I just wanted to give you room to finish your thought because we said we were all on the edge of our seats as you were talking, and then Angela is going to circle back in, and then we're going to open up to see what other questions or comments that folks might have and how they'd like to see this conversation move. So did you want to finish your thought?
Sure. Thank you. Excuse me, y'all. It is that day, and I know people can relate. I mean, I think the crux of it is that everything that's said, ideas of power, the interconnectedness on how when you continue to target Black and Brown communities, unless you are a part of that, I hate to use this acronym, but the 1%, the trickle effect is real. And I started to see that and learn that in the pandemic. Disinvestment in Black and Brown communities and public hospitals has spilled over into almost all hospitals, right? Disinvestment in public education has moved away for this child care crisis. We have, I hate to be doom and gloom today, but a crisis with housing that a lot of us been talking about for many years. But we fear is going to be metastasized with families being once you're 3 and 4 months behind rent, it's extremely difficult to ever catch up. As families are falling behind on their mortgage because of the mass unemployment and folks having to either be furloughed or having their hours cut so they can't hope to pay for things, it's going to have a serious impact. So I'm excited to be in community with so many people who are looking to hopefully build together on how we both shift narrative and push action that force a reckoning on how we're dealing with our budgets. Because while yes, I am deeply invested in liberation and self-determination for Black and Brown communities, I know that power together looks like building with Mark, building with folks who are outside of my community and who are clear that we are interconnected in this, right? Because maybe it falls for myself and my members 3 months of rent, but most people after 6 months, right? We're in that same kind of stage. So how do we do some of the bold things that our comrades in New York City at Brooklyn Movement Center and Vocal and Communities for Police Reform we're looking to do with challenging these budgets and saying that we can't just throw our hands up at the sky. There are actually things we have to do, and if we're challenging power, that's how we can do it. I know it's happening in Minneapolis and so many other places, and I'm just deeply grateful for the brave souls who continue to do it as we build community together. Want to see more of it with all of us.
Thank you so much. And I think just to underscore that the way in which you keep coming back to building together and building community together, and how important that is for the notion of power as we move to Angela, because on the table now is the question of the public. Like, we actually have an opportunity to undermine the notion of the individual, which is in essence the foundation of the ability to commodify, is to like segment and autonomize us. But we have to actually have this opportunity to redefine the notion of the public and to redefine the importance of a government public as a part of an instrumental part of those legs of the table that is important for supporting our lives. And so, Angela, I asked you to start us with some dreaming, because oftentimes we're so in the trenches that we don't know what might be possible. And so what are some of the things, or a thing, that you would like us to grapple with while we're together today and beyond?
Yeah, so one of the things I'm really struck by in this moment where, again, we're experiencing a very acute economic and public health crisis is that, certainly COVID is ultimately what sparked it, but frankly, most of what it did was illuminate problems and inequities in our society that were longstanding, right? So, we're having sort of a moment where we're having a childcare crisis and a housing crisis and an employment crisis. 5.4 million people lost their health insurance as a result of losing their jobs. And certainly, COVID has something to do with it, but fundamentally those are problems in our society and our economy that we have ignored for a long time, too long. And it sort of, I think, to Afia's point earlier, sort of underlies the cost to all of us of anti-Blackness, right? So if austerity is rooted in racism, and that means that we can't have a childcare system that keeps every kid safe and healthy. We can't have housing that keeps, every family, puts a roof over every family's head. Workers can't have power on the job, and all of those things are sort of rooted in this scarcity mindset, the individualism that is ultimately an anti-Black sentiment. Then it means we're all worse off. And so I think in this particular moment, we have to think about what it will take to pull us out of this crisis, but we also have to really think hard about the policies that we're going to enact to make sure that we don't wind up here again. This is the second once-in-a-lifetime economic crisis of the last decade. And the reality is, for Black people specifically, we never recovered from the last one. And so much of that is rooted in austerity policy and politics. The thing that I always think of is I started my career working on Capitol Hill, and it was in the midst of the recession, and sort of right after we officially came out of the recession, conservatives, enabled in part by Democrats, moved into this austerity frame where all of a sudden we had to cut spending, we had to cut budgets, we had to tighten our belts as a country, forgetting that both, one, in that moment, what we really needed to do to have a robust recovery was spend money, and two, that we were moments out of the recession. So, even though I take issue with the premise that we needed to tighten our belts at all, certainly if there was time to do it, that was not it. And the result was we had a recovery that took much longer, and Black communities in particular were harmed the most. Black communities lost half their wealth, haven't regained it back. And so there are real long-term consequences to sort of moving in this austerity frame and not addressing those underlying structural issues. And then I think one thing that we need to think about as we're thinking about the solutions to this crisis, in addition to thinking about the long-term structural change that we need to see, is we need to think about how we're measuring what it means to have recovered in the first place, right? So when those austerity measures that I mentioned were enacted, white unemployment was in the single digits and never went into the double digits, and Black unemployment was somewhere around 17%. So the idea that we were even in a recovery when Black unemployment is at 17% is absurd. And you're seeing the same thing happen right now. There's been some, I think mostly on the conservative side, but like there's been, this idea that unemployment is declining, so things are getting better, but Black male unemployment actually rose last month and the month before it. And I think what you're seeing is real-time labor market discrimination that's happening because there's, more people who are looking for jobs, and employers can be choosier about who they hire and who do they not want to hire Black people. And so, thinking about the way that we develop our policies and think about, who is impacted in what way, what does it mean for Black communities to have recovered in this crisis, and what more do we need to do to make sure that Black communities to continue to recover and actually get back to where we were, and then get beyond where we were, because that wasn't so great either, is really crucial. I just want to briefly mention, Dorian and Sabeel had a great piece in The Nation yesterday on this idea of a third reconstruction, which I think is exactly how we need to think of this moment. It's not just getting through the immediate crisis, it's really thinking long-term about how do we want to fundamentally transform this country, our economy, our society, democracy, in a way that centers marginalized communities, that centers Black folks, and that makes sure that we are all benefiting from the wealth that exists in this country.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you mentioning Sabeel's piece, because I agree, if we had a framework around Reconstruction, then we would be having a framework that says, how do we actually integrate every human being into our economic, political, social, cultural life, right? That's a bigger endeavor rather than a tiny policy slice, and it's something that we have not been able to get to. But we are in this time, this conjunctural moment, they call it, when everything can be reframed if we only know how to enter in and then turn it in our direction. And so, Afia, I'm looking to see first if Trisha has any questions that she has pulled from folks, and then if not, I'm coming right at you with a question, Sister Afia. So Trisha, do we have any questions, or should I keep moving? You are on mute.
Sorry. We have two, so I'm happy to throw those out, see who's most intrigued to answer, and then we can see where the conversation goes.
All right.
I'm going to say them both and then we can answer as needed. So one person would like to know, can you elaborate on how budget cuts or austerity measures, as you've mentioned, have a greater impact on Black communities and why exactly that is? And then we have another person who asks, how much do you estimate that weak census response may affect the nation's ability to address the multiple crises facing the nation? Is there any way to compensate for low response in the very areas where COVID and financial problems are hitting the hardest?
Nice. So I'm going to add a twist on the first question on austerity and ask for you to jump in first, Angela, since you specifically mentioned it, and then we can have Mark or Afia jump in. In addition to the question, I just think it is such a contradiction in some ways that we're talking about austerity and not enough resources, and yet when we get into these recessions, the first thing that is done is to try to give a couple of $100s to people to go spend. And so I'm just really intrigued by that contradiction and how can we actually exploit the contradiction to talk about, well, no, clearly tightening up and having austerity is not the pathway out, and they know it. You know, the pathway out is really to continue to push resources into our communities and into the economy. And yet the question becomes, who gets to do it and at what level and for what purpose? So I'd be really curious about some of your take on that.
Yeah, you know, in some ways, I mean, obviously there was plenty of bad stuff in the CARES Act and some of the corporate, you know, $500 billion to corporations that the Treasury Secretary got to do whatever he wants with. It's not great, but I would say, you know, actually in many ways, it was sort of an affirmation of the, you know, I think our view of how the economy actually does work, right? You know, the major investments in the legislation were in, you know, sending money to states and localities, to providing, you know, people who made under $90,000 with some level of stimulus check. It was enhancing UI to a level that people could actually potentially like pay their bills during this crisis. And so I think that's exactly right. Like in many ways that sort of validates this idea that you have to invest in people in order to improve the economy. So whether or not that was the intention, I think that that's something we can point to say like, this is actually the way that you put the economy on a more stable footing. I think in terms of what it means to have austerity and how that impacts communities of color, I think Afia can probably talk more about this, but you know, I mean, one of the things that we've seen sort of time and again is that when state and local budgets are cut, you know, we cut sort of core services that actually help people. And the way that those funds are recouped is by basically extracting money from Black and Brown communities. One of my colleagues at the Jhumpa Bhattacharya at the Insight Center cited this on another webinar, and I'm going to get the statistic wrong, but in the DOJ Ferguson report, one of the things they said about the fines and fees collected at the local level there was that it was basically propping up the entire city. And so, you know, in a universe where we're talking about scarce resources and the only resources can be extracted from the people who have the least, we have a problem. And so, you know, that speaks to a couple of things. I think one, it speaks to the way, you know, that's sort of like not a natural state, right? Like that speaks to priorities, you know, especially in this moment where we're talking about police budgets. I can say in DC, you know, that's one of the last things to get cut, even when we're in a, you know, a fiscal crisis, right? So I think, you know, there's a question of priorities. And then there is also this important piece that the federal government at some point does have to step in. And, you know, now is certainly the time. There are, I think, 45 states who have balanced budget amendments. The federal government doesn't have those same types of budgetary constraints that the states do. And so what we need to be doing at the federal level is pumping a ton of money into the state and local level to both make sure that essential services that actually do keep people safe and healthy aren't cut, and that states and localities don't use this moment to recoup revenue on the backs of Black people.
Thank you. Before I go to Mark, can I just zero in on this by going to Afia, because I know that they've done a ton of work around participatory budgeting. And it, you know, at the city level, I'm wondering for you to talk a little bit about that, and what might some possibilities be for how we should think about even our larger scale, because we are at a point now where states are saying that they don't have the resources, and the national government is saying, well, we're not going to give it to you. And so we are poised to see so much of this squeeze. Again, really talking about the power that you all are building to get people to really pay attention to budgeting as a key mechanism for us to address some of these questions.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think participatory budgeting gives some venue or some way, right, for individuals in targeted community to come together to start making their own priorities, right? So when we think about that framing of self-determination, I think is a really helpful way to do some of this combat against the current narrative of, right, issues of supremacy, individualism, folks having to come together, make some decisions based on this finite amount of money, pot of money they have, to make decisions about what they think would be the best for their community. And I don't want to sugarcoat it, right? There's fight in that, right? Nothing is all, you know, beautiful and anything, but I think it is a good start, right? And I have to acknowledge it was actually, you know, it came to New York City after a alderman from Chicago came and talked about it, right? So I think it is a mechanism, and we have to think a lot bigger, right? We in New York City have come to a point where it's ingrained in the vast majority of the city council members. So it's hyper local, neighborhood level, and the city council level. And part of the, I would say, the fight and the push has got to be bigger pots of money, right? Move it from individual city council members, so that's agency budgets, right? So we're talking about larger pots and bigger visions. And I know we'll come to this, but I saw someone put in the chat the idea of how we use this time to push for bigger things. I think participatory budget can be a piece of that. I would also say that I would love in this moment, right? I love that phrase you used, Charlene, of, right, it was this contiguous leverage point, or like a reflection point of where we can hopefully have, right, some of the larger national organizations, be they policy, be they, you know, lobbyists, working with grassroots organizations and folks on the ground to jointly push a larger vision, right? I said we all have this role, the different roles we play in the movement, but I think this is a time where we should jointly go forward and just jump. Say those things we're scared of, right? That number at the federal budget that they're gonna say you're a Bolshevik, let them laugh at you, right? Like let's shoot for the stars on this, right? I agree so deeply with Angela that there were some real issues in the CARES Act, but I think a piece, the real issue with it, they didn't go big enough, right? $1,200 was a start to get people's beak wet. And in many places, $1,200 is not gonna pay your rent or your mortgage, or it will force you to choose. Do I do groceries and a little bit of this? Do I do that? Do I send money to someone? Do I pay for transportation, or do I put some money on my rent or my mortgage? I think this is the time where we have to speak to our boldest selves, right? To the largest piece of what we want for us collectively, not the deal that we've been cutting. I think we should start from the premise that everything that we've been doing to this point is not enough. Let's assume that it was with good intention, rooted in love, and all that we thought we could get done at the time. But we don't have the luxury anymore of the deal, right? We have the necessity of the whole, because people are doing no less than dying right now. So we've got to speak to our boldest selves. We've got to fight those impossible campaigns against powerful entities like the police department, like corporations, like these hedge fund managers who are taking over people's homes as a commodity. We have got to name them, right? Fight them and push for the folks who enable them to fall. And I think that's the point where we are, and that's how we can push those bigger, bolder demands, and not to assume like a lot of city and state budgets are over, but we're always in the middle, planning, strategizing, tooling up that campaign so that we're collecting with the federal, right, goes to the local, and pushing for more power in the local municipalities, because that's where a lot of folks are able to actually organize.
Thank you so much. Mark, did you want to contribute to this bigger, bolder, let's go after it?
Yep.
Go for it.
Yeah, let's go for it. I mean, you know, not least of which, because you know who is always being their boldest selves? The other side. They're always being their boldest selves. They're not afraid to talk about what they want in terms of quote unquote drowning government in a bathtub, right? You know, these are the things you hear that, you know, that if we are not affirmatively naming the world we want to see and affirmatively talking about what is going to not just meet this moment, but actually build on the world, just actually build a vision, I think, we're bound to fall short. So, again, I'll go back to the CARES Act. There were some really, decent pieces in it that helped keep some families whole, not all. On the student loan side, there's a moratorium on paying your student loans. Why we are not talking about canceling debt for people instead of just making sure people's monthly payments are paused until the end of the summer when there's a crisis all over again, when there already was a crisis, and specifically a Black student debt crisis, is a failure of imagination, right, on the part of policymakers, not on the part of those who are deeply in the work. So yeah, what do we have to lose by being our biggest, boldest selves? One other piece that I think, one of the early questions was about, why austerity and why public disinvestment is specifically acute for Black folks in particular. I just think I go back to the interconnected piece of this and think about the choices we can make to invest public resources in housing, healthcare, education, any number of things. When we don't invest in public housing or stem an eviction crisis that is coming or offer rent relief, families go into debt, into credit card debt, or turn to predatory loans or payday loans, or deplete savings, or do anything they can to keep a roof over their kids' heads. When families face health emergencies and we have not invested vital public resources in making sure that you are never bankrupted from healthcare costs, families go into medical debt. When we do not invest in public goods like education or higher education, people go into student debt to pay for that and to pay for the rent that we haven't helped them pay. So it manifests itself in any number of ways. Debt is sort of a dollar figure that you can put on it at a household level, but it's everything, right? So when we're being I'm saying that because when we're being our boldest selves, we can't just be bold within one policy silo. We can't be bold within, one specific area of a CARES Act, of a HEROES Act, at a state budget, at a local budget. It has to be bigger, and in that way, it's more powerful. That's what I would contribute.
Thank you so much. I think that Trisha has a couple more questions, but I just so you know, I'm gonna circle back because this is one of my favorite parts of the conversation. And Jim had said it a little earlier around should we be using a different language? And I think underneath that question is this question around how we organizing narrative and ideas towards a different vision. A part of the piece around going bold is that there has been this narrative of who deserves and who doesn't deserve for so long that that we tend to call pragmatic what is really an acquiescence to the narrative that we're undeserving. And so I love the go big and bold because that is also a statement around that we deserve what we, everything that we ought to have to be able to thrive and to live good and healthy lives. And so at some point, if we have time, I want to really circle back around this question of how are we organizing in the sphere of ideas and of narrative to help us move in that direction. But I want to give other folks an opportunity to come in. So Trisha, what are the other questions you may have?
Well, I'll say your eagle eyes picked out one of the key ones, and definitely this how we do it in the narrative is a key theme. So awesome. And then just a few others to add to the conversation, which you've all started to key in on is, so we've had the CARES Act and moments like that, but how do we use this moment to create real structural change? Is that possible in this moment of crisis? Then we also have people love the moment and pushing for anti-racist policy. However, the devil is in the details and requires sustained efforts and resources, and public attention tends to wane once it starts getting into the weeds. How can we push to do the hard work that is required?
All right, I'm gonna let whoever wants to jump in that one, jump in, or else I'm gonna call on you.
I'll speak to a little. I know I've been a little doom and gloom on the moment that we're in. And I think this gives an opportunity to say, some of my comrades, I think about dear comrade Maurice Mitchell, who's talking about, we're winning on a lot of these narrative fights. And I just hope that, you know, I want to share that so we can take a moment to drink that in, right? I guess I'm youngish. I'm on the other side of 35. And when I came into movement as a public defender, and the conversations that are happening now around incarceration, right? Public defenders, around district attorneys and accountability would have never happened 15 years ago, right? We would be chastised when we were saying that the cop is lying or someone is lying. It just would never happen. And so the narrative shift that's happening is because of extremely hard work for folks who had their boots on the ground and were clear what they were fighting for. And I think this moment of crisis, as an initially point, gives a leverage point for folks to continue hammering home on both the narrative and to the point that Tricia raised in one of the questions about the details. And I think part of how we sustain that is a little what I was talking about, the marrying of the national to the local groups, right? The folks who are on the ground have a vested interest to see that their campaign wins are real wins, right? That we are able to continue and see it through. And so I think that a lot of that is happening and needs continued support. There's space for that as people are questioning, and sadly as people are hurting more, right? As people are grappling with how they're, to Mark's point, going to make choices about healthcare and medications versus rent versus food and childcare, whether to go to work or stay home, is going to have a lot of folks, I think, in this nexus point where we have space to bring people to question, right? And to your piece, Charlene, about narrative and individual, like how can we move forward if we assume that everybody deserves to win, right? What is that policy platform look like? We assume that everybody has value and that they all deserve to win, right? And we navigated that way. I think there's a lot of possibility, but at the very least, at this moment, a lot of people are at least asking a question, which is not everything, but gives me a little bit of hope as we move forward and continue to build campaign.
I love that. And I want to, I'm going to go ahead to you, Angela, around the unemployment insurance, because part of that, what happens if we assume that everyone deserves, is deeply tied in this unemployment insurance piece. And so go for it.
Yeah, so first, I just want to agree with Afia. I think, you know, it is sort of encouraging at this moment to see that our narratives are winning. And I think so much of that credit goes to folks who are literally putting their lives and bodies on the line right now. And, you know, for the movement for Black Lives, for sort of racial justice and defunding the police and sort of the economic freedom that comes along with that as well. So, you know, I think that's super important. I think on this question of like, what happens when the sort of fervor dies down is, I think, you know, like I said, people are putting their bodies and lives on the line. The least folks who are working on the policy could do is, you know, make sure that that results in some change to our material conditions, right? Like if all that happens, to your point earlier, is that like Black Lives Matter gets painted across main streets across the country, but fundamentally we don't see Black liberation, then we haven't met the moment. And so I think that's something that's really important to think about, is like there is this moment of movement, but now we have to really move toward building lasting change. On this immediate question of UI, you know, I think this is actually another area where, again, sort of our narrative on what the economy is, who it's for, and how it works is really taking hold. I think it's, you know, we've done some public opinion research on this, and you know, I know other folks have worked on this as well. You know, people really do buy into the fact that, you know, unemployment insurance is keeping the economy afloat. It's helping Black and brown communities. It's making sure that we can all stay safe and healthy, and fundamentally, calls to cut that are undermining all of those things. You know, the sort of, it's been interesting to watch, actually. The old conservative argument has been trotted out already that this is a disincentive to work, which, like, where do we hear that? It's sort of like leaning into like myths about welfare that we've heard for decades now. But the interesting thing is it's not working. You know, this is something we actually tested specifically in a poll we did a couple of weeks ago, and people are not persuaded by that. Which I think shows real progress. You know, I think if we'd even asked that question 6 months ago, the answer maybe would have been different. because so much of the mythology we tell ourselves about who gets what in this country is rooted in these ideas of deservedness. But I think, all of a sudden when there are 30 million people and it's you and it's your family members and it's your cousin and your brother who are going to get kicked out of their house, who aren't going to be able to feed their kids next month because their incomes will be cut in half or or more, all of a sudden you start to understand this isn't about deservedness. This is about, scarcity for all the rest of us. And while those who are at the top, aren't suffering at all. And in fact, in some ways are benefiting from this crisis. So, I think it will be devastating if the additional $600 is not extended. But that said, I also think that even conservatives know it will be devastating for the economy if the additional $600 isn't extended. And I think, in the next 11 days that we have until that deadline hits, and hopefully they'll act sooner, it would be great for both state UI systems if they act sooner and for people's certainty and peace of mind. I think that I hope that they will act, and I think that there's a lot of work to be done to sort of push on that idea that this is not the time to invest in people. This is, of course, the time to invest in people. It's always the time to invest, a good time to invest in people, and certainly now it's crucial.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to pass it to you too to talk a little bit about that investing in people and to push us a little bit around this piece on debt in higher education, because in my mind, one of the greatest pathways towards desegregating is the pathway into various educational formations that folks don't normally get to go to. Like, I didn't have any engagement with anyone other than literally 3 white kids in my high school, and 2 of them were twins. And so, this is the truth. And I think about, I'm old enough now to understand what my debt formation was then, as opposed to now with my granddaughter going to college, what that means for how they are structuring basically her being chained to debt for the rest of her life. And if I don't have it, or we collectively can't resource that, then she automatically is going to be at a place where the choices for what she can potentially do becomes increasingly limited and segregated. And so sometimes we don't think about the importance of that piece for our work. So similarly to unemployment insurance, like what does the framework of deserving versus undeserving and who gets to be invested in, how does that impact the work that you're doing?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's a crucial question, right? I think, I'd go back to something Angela said before around the absurdity around sort of economic thinking, or just a general narrative that we're in recovery when Black unemployment was 17-16%, for example. The idea that another popular narrative that student debt is good debt. It has always been an absurdity that you can say that when half of Black men will default on a student loan within 12 years of starting college. So, that gets, we can talk about the sort of policy mechanisms that get us there, but part of it is continuing, and I agree we're winning on this front, and on some of these fronts at least. But a lot of it is getting at the narrative and really questioning sort of these broad, almost flippant assumptions about who is doing well, or what it means to have an economy that's doing well, or a system that's doing well, or to have debt that's good or bad or whatever. That's real, and that has implications for policy. I think the thing I just sort of add on the just linking public investment to debt a little bit is that it's not just that we're not investing in public institutions, community colleges, HBCUs, all of the avenues for opportunity. It's not just that, and that means rising costs, that means fewer seats, that means less, that means the adjunctification and the contingency of faculty, that means, that has all manner of impacts in those systems generally. But when we saw this happen at the beginning of this century and in the 1990s, that when we don't invest in public institutions, we don't care about consumer protection, predatory institutions will fill the void, right? So we've seen that with predatory lending. We saw that with predatory for-profit colleges. You know, that is something that is real, that obviously manifests itself in debt. But in other words, if your local community college system is so starved of funding, or the people have to take on debt to go to community college, and over half of Black graduates of community college take on loans, which is an unconscionable stat to me. If that system does not have enough resources to provide seats, flexible schedules, facilities, faculty, you name it, at a low cost, ITT Tech has the oxygen to exist, right? So, you know, it has implication on the household level, on the debt of someone, on the psychological impact of that debt, not just the financial piece of it. But disinvesting in public systems allows, you know, something's going to fill the void, and I think that's we've seen time and time again across different areas of our economy, right? That's a tale that's very old and can be told in different sectors. So, you know, that's why we have to have an interconnected narrative. That's why we can't just talk about, you know, student debt rising and it being fine because white college graduates do fine because they have some of their grandparents and parents' money to play with, right? That's a real dynamic that that shows up in the data, and it shows up in how we tell that story.
Great, thank you. Trisha, you have a couple more questions. We've got about 15 minutes or so. I want to stop at about 20 after to enable all of our panelists to give a couple of minutes of last words. So a couple more questions and then we'll do some last words.
Yeah, I've got three more. So nationwide, with the educational racial divide wider now than it was with Brown versus Board of Ed, tax cuts and economic policy making the rich richer and poor poorer, can you all cite any municipalities that are succeeding in delivering economic, educational, and racial justice? So some positive examples. Also bringing back to the moment of COVID, we have this working from home or new normal is effectively a transfer of wealth from the employees to their employers. Employers traditionally provide office space, but now employees are expected to provide that space for free, as well as cover the increased utility usage that goes along with that. Further, working from home inherently favors the housing secure. This new normal just seems to be another economic realignment that favors wealthier, whiter households and raises the bar to economic opportunity for families of color. And lastly, many advocacy groups, sometimes prodded by funders, are scrambling to demonstrate their anti-racist credentials, but not always doing the internal work. How are each of the groups addressing internal racial segregation, i.e. having Black folks work on outreach and operations and white or white adjacent folks on policy and strategy?
Those are good. All right. How about, y'all are on my screen like this. So can I do Afia, Angela, Mark? And you can take any one of those that you choose to.
Okay.
I know, right? Those are.
They want the fire at the end.
They came in, yes. They wouldn't even let us like glide towards the end. They're like, no, we're gonna keep y'all in this fire all the way to the end. Go ahead.
Ooh. So I'll take a quick bit of, so the two, okay. So the working from home resonated for me, because clearly, and I'm thinking about how, like, yes, 100% we're employers, and I'm one, right? I run a community-based organization. We've been working from home through March, and what that looks like and what it means for people in their space, and assuming that people have quiet space that they can use for times and trying to think through those hard questions. But as a member-based organization, I'll also say it's tested us in, I know the framing is that the broadband issue is just in the rural areas. Our headquarters is in East Harlem. You know, we had to purchase 500 tablets with prepaid internet, right, to send out to our membership so that we could do Zoom calls and meetings and check in, and so that they could go online to do all the things they need to do for services. So a tension that's come for me is the amount of money that, you know, and CVH is not alone in this. A lot of community-based organizations are doing so. The amount of money that we're moving to these telecoms, right, for broadband that is now an actual, it's a necessity, right? It's not a luxury. Having the internet for people whose kids are home trying to school, for folks who are able to work from home is a necessity. And I would argue for even people who are not in those places, as sadly states are reclosing and municipalities are reclosing, the only way to access services is through online. And it's not something that particularly Black communities have access to. And so that has me thinking about how it wasn't an issue that we were organizing around, but it's agitated me to think through that more and to build with our members to think how we grapple with that. And I'll say, I love that question on the idea of loving the slogans of Black Lives Matter and not living it in not just your mission, but who is on your staff and how that's moved. And I'll say, something that I'm proud of at Community Voices Heard, our, senior management team are all folks of color, but more important than that, I think since we have a membership base that we're clear we're accountable to, the goal has always been one of development. That's for membership, that's for staff. And so when we engage in campaigns, a success isn't just winning the campaign, right? The success is how many people now know how to run a campaign. How are we thinking through strategy? Who are the allies and new relationships and associations that we're building with to teach us that? And I think that's something that we're having to do a lot more to hold us accountable, right? Not just that one person is doing it or making policy, like how are we doing it and how are we taking over and reclaiming policy space, not just to be able to do the important data work, but to do the original framing of what the goal is of the legislation, right? To my earlier point, if we believe that everybody should win, that's our policy starting point, right? We believe people need to be housed. That's how we're starting from that policy. We'll get the data from somebody after. And so I think those types of conversations need to happen. I'm hoping that funders are going to do more of, aside from pushing for the numbers, which most funders do, ask how many people are people of color, gender nonconforming, to ask what position do they hold and what's the value in those positions and how are they setting up. I would end on this as a newish ED, the first Black ED in my organization, with a lot of sisters coming in on that. How are they training the next generation of leadership in their development, right? So it's not a one-off, look what we did. It's this is what we are committed to and we are keeping that pipeline going.
Thanks, Sophia. Angela?
100% to all of that. And I'll actually go back really quickly to, on the municipal question, I'm actually mostly interested in Charlene's answer. So I hope she will answer the question later since she seemed to have thoughts. But going back to the other two questions, I think one thing that I think we should always be thinking about as top of mind is, right now we're in this crisis where you see a lot and hear a lot that Black workers are, disproportionately unable to work from home, disproportionately essential workers, more likely to be laid off, more likely to get COVID, more likely to die of COVID, all these things that we describe as like more or less likely depending on identity. Fundamentally, when you see those disparities, we're always looking at racism as the root cause of those. So I think as we're thinking about what the policy solutions are, we really have to be thinking about the fact that these are not race neutral outcomes, and the policies that we enact to address them also similarly could not be race neutral. I would argue that there's actually really no such thing as race neutral, because you can have sort of like race ignorant policies, I suppose, that don't account for racial disparities, but really we're always talking about race, even when we're not. And on this question of sort of institutions, all of us work in progressive spaces. I think this has been an interesting moment, to be totally frank. Being progressive and being, on this side versus the other side does not automatically mean anti-racist. And I think that's something for all of us to sit with, and the discomfort that might cause some folks, but it is the reality. And so I think this is a moment to really step back and think about how can organizations that ostensibly want to provide for everyone, that want to be invested in justice, also, how can those organizations also be anti-racist? And, you know, that starts from looking at, you know, the leadership, looking at who's in positions of power, what those positions are, what they have influence over. I think Afia's point is totally right. You know, you can have folks in a senior position in a policy space who ultimately don't have any say over the policy choices that that organization makes or puts out. And so, you know, it's both, you know, having people in leadership positions, making sure it's across, you know, in a variety of types of leadership positions. And then it's the training and also the support. You know, it can be really hard to be a person of color, a woman of color in these spaces. Often, you know, you can be the only one, and I hope that's not for long. And I know that many of us are dedicated to making sure that there are folks who can come after us in these roles. But it really is, I think, a moment for self-reflection across, you know, all of our institutions to think about what we can do to make sure that we're both, you know, working on anti-racism in our work, but also doing that work in our own houses as well.
Mark?
Yeah, these questions beget more questions, and I want this panel to go for 4 more hours, and that's not fair to anyone here. I think just the organizational piece. So I have worked in policy organizations, you know, for the better part of my career, progressive policy organizations. And Angela, I want to lift up your point that, you know, we cannot equate progressive with anti-racist for any number of reasons that are bubbling up now. And I think one thing that I think it's incumbent upon us to do at this moment, and it was incumbent before this moment, is to really interrogate what we value when we mean someone is an expert at something, when someone is brought in as a policy expert, and what kind of expertise is valued. Because I will say that as a white man doing this work in my career, you know, that has, when someone is striving to be a policy expert, often that means, you know, a specific narrative around research and data and what you're bringing to policymakers or to the media or what have you. And that is traditionally been valued over lived experience in a way that I think is incredibly damaging to the policy conversation, right? So it's incumbent upon us to build pipelines, to build, you know, relationships, but to also just shape and change narratives about what counts as expertise in this moment and what can inform policy conversations based on that expertise, particularly lived experience. Is a way to start to dig at that in this moment, but that's surely not enough, right?
So I'm going to make a statement because Angela directly asked me to, and then I will turn it over to all of you to make a final statement. The question around the municipalities, I think I will turn it back to Angela's statement about race is at the root. And I don't think that there is any place, whether that is a municipal space or an institutional space, whether that organization is even a progressive organizing organization, because most of the organizations that we lead have been created by white people, and at their center, even the methodology is steeped so deeply in questions around race. And so I think that until we get to a place where we are prepared to actually not believe that we are in neutral spaces and have the courage to excavate where that racism shows up, then what tends to happen is that we move around as these like really good progressive people and we're doing damage. And so I think that it is really important for us to be able to do that. So are there places where we see things happening in ways that are fabulous? And I don't think there can be, and not in this moment. And this question of who deserves and who doesn't deserve, and the, you know, the legacy of the BLM narrative and Occupy narrative, I think all of those things are important. And I come back to where Afia came in when she talked about managing her kids. You know, the BLM narrative is on the graves of children. You know, it's built on the graves of children. And see, until we actually like grapple with that, and if we can't grapple with that, we can't even grapple with the fact that every single structure that we are talking about, our debt structure, our governmental structure, you know, everything is actually built on the graves and blood of Black people. And so if we're not dealing with that, then it is hard for me to even think about like, where will the balance come from? And so we are doing our best, I believe, in whatever place we sit in to try to create some level of equity. And we're constantly coming up against our inability or the lack of even the tools to get clear about what those structures are that have brought us here, so that we can effectively dismantle them and create something else, right? So we can't be really clear about that until we're prepared to do that. And, you know, I'm not quite as pessimistic, even though it may sound like I am right now. Now, I'm not quite as pessimistic, but I do believe that in many of our organizations, progressive or not, left or not, that we suffer from a great deal of paternalism that is prepared to spout language and not prepared to actually do the deep work of confronting how these structures have been built up. And part of that is our own work that we need to do. Part of that is the collective pushback against funders who are also operating according to these narratives that have enslaved us and now enslave us in these organizations, enslave us in these methodologies, enslave us in transactional mechanisms that continue to perpetuate who deserves and who doesn't deserve, right? And so I think we've got a lot of work to do. And a big piece of that work is the deep ways in which we craft real, honest, authentic relationships that can stand up to the truth. And once we're able to do that, I think we'll be on a pathway to actually answering that question in the affirmative. But at this point, I don't think we're there yet. So that's a lot more than you asked for, Angela. So, so now we've got a couple minutes. So I want to thank you all, but give you like 30 seconds of final thoughts that you would like to leave people with before we close. So let's go the other way. Mark, and then how about Mark, Sophia, and Angela?
Oh gosh, I mean, just I'm soaking in the brilliance of the rest of this panel, so I'll make it brief. I think one thing I wanted to make a plug for, as we're talking about budgets and budgetary and economic policies in this moment. And I would be remiss as a person from Demos if I did not mention that there's a democracy answer, a small d democracy answer to a lot of this too. So I think there was a question before about how we build structural change into some of these, you know, policies, whether that's CARES Act at the federal level or something else. And, you know, I think it's incumbent upon us and the movement to think about ways to democratize a lot of our systems, whether that's resources at a local level. My colleagues at Demos, particularly Laura Williamson, are working on this as well. You know, people's control of their own resources and the economic decision making. We talked a little bit about participatory budgeting as one example as well. But there's ways to build in, you know, accountability and democracy in a lot of this, right? And I think that's part of the answer for building structural change into this and making sure that it's not just a one-time injection of $1,200 or a one-time expansion of UI or something like that, that it's perpetual, right? So I think that's work I'm excited to think through.
Thank you. Sophia, now you have 20 seconds.
Okay, so thank you to everyone. I'm just so glad to have been a part of this amazing energy this afternoon. And I would, you know, the organizer in me likes to leave with folks with things to do, right? Next steps. And the initial, I would say, is to become a part of or to provide alliance or build with relationships with local community organizations in your communities. When you started us off, Charlene, folks were from Ohio. I saw some folks from the Bay, all over, to build relationships with those folks, right? So that we have, how do we get to the idea of believing that everybody can win? It's by building some relationships, right? To your point, relationships that can stand in some tension and deal with truth so that we can push each other together. And I think a lot of us relate nationally, which is important. But having someone that holds you accountable an entity locally, I think is extremely important. So that's why I want to push folks today.
Thank you. Angela.
Yeah, so I'm really glad to be included in this conversation. Thanks to Charlene, Afia, and Mark. It's been so great to talk to you all. You know, I think this is a strange moment because in many ways it it's really scary and really alarming, and I worry a lot about what people are going through every day, both the uncertainty and the precarity. But I think we have a real opportunity here. I do think that there is momentum generated by, again, the uprisings that we've seen across the country, by people realizing that fundamentally we are working with an economic system that was not built for us and will never work for us. And so I think, you know, it's incumbent on us in this moment to really sort of seize on this momentum and turn it into some real lasting change. So I'm encouraged by this conversation. I think that if we can move in a direction that helps us, I think going back to Fia's point in the beginning, build power and shift power, then we'll be in a much better place. So thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you again to the panelists, to the amazing Demos team behind the scenes, and to everyone that's hung in there with us. And we look forward to seeing you all on the next go around. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful afternoon. Yeah, Oprah, watch out. I'm coming. I'm coming for you, Oprah.